Hi everybody, this is Chapter 10 in EDUC 103, Maltreatment of Children, Abuse, and Neglect. As always, I present for you the NAEYC standards that are accompany this one. You'll notice that these ones kind of jump around a little bit, but I do think it's important to know that we're still looking at the fundamental beliefs in all of the NAEYC standards. So, out of the block of chapters that we're covering, this is the last chapter. I'm selective on the chapters, but I think this one needs to be included because I think it's one of the most important. I realize most of the people that are taking this class might not aspire to be a school guidance counselor or a school administrator. That being said, as a teacher, you have to be very cautious over signs and symptoms of abuse and neglect, and I think it's something you'll see in your position. I'm going to talk about this throughout today, but it's imperative that you hear my message on this. As school teachers in the United States, if you see a child being abused, you are a mandatory reporter. But if you tackle that abuse yourself, you are highly, highly, highly foolish. If you see a child that you believe is being abused, the school should have a guidance counselor and they should have principals that can help you with the child abuse situation. My advice to every single one of you watching this is don't try to fix it yourself. Don't confront a parent yourself, because if something's wrong, that parent's going to go sue. And if also the child doesn't admit to the abuse, then you could have a problem and a challenge as well. So keep that in mind. There's over 3 million cases of abuse in the United States every year. My belief is that there's double of it that just goes unreported. Children don't report abuse because of fear and retaliation from their parents, especially when they're between about the ages of 7 and 10. A 15 or 16-year-old, yeah, they're likely to report abuse, but you're not working with this population of kids. You're working with ones that are scared of their parents and they're worried that their parents are going to get taken away from them, so they're not going to report it. So this is a difficult scenario for teachers to help and support. It's a big, big, big challenge. So I find this fascinating. Child abuse wasn't discovered until 1874, and nobody helped the child. They said it was perfectly acceptable for a child to be beat until an animal abuse society stepped in. So before 1876, you wanted to beat your child up, you beat your child up as much as you wanted. But the New York Society for Cruelty to Animals stepped in and argued that a human being was an animal. So parents were found guilty of cruelty to animals, and the child was removed from the home. So that was the first case of child abuse, and that's less than 150 years ago. So think about that. Imagine what life was like in the 1700s. So now, mind you, that happened in 1874. Abuse doesn't get media attention until 1961. So this is still a new concept. We're only a little over 50 years looking at child abuse. This was the idea of battered child syndrome. But even then, it took 13 more years to pass a law to prevent child abuse. So, prior to 1961, you could still hit your kids, abuse your kids, probably without many repercussions. It took until 1974 until a law was passed to prevent child abuse. So, this is important. For those of you taking the PEC test, this is 100% going to be on there. You need to know this law. 1974 was the first law to protect against child maltreatment. Each state had a certain agency that investigated and prosecuted. Different states handled this differently. Some states were very proactive, some states weren't. 1996 was when stricter punishments came along. You could still hit your children up until 1996. You could. You just had to make sure that you were hitting them in a manner that wasn't leaving permanent marking and permanent damage on them. So my belief is this. It hasn't been prosecuted since 1996, so you're going to encounter parents and grandparents that think corporal punishment is still acceptable. In terms of the state of Pennsylvania, this is weird. If you look at the books, there's only 4 states where corporal punishment is on the books. Pennsylvania, corporal punishment is completely legal. You are allowed to hit your children in the state of Pennsylvania. And principals are trained as to how to hit a child. It's not going to happen, but we're trained in it. In order to paddle a child in the state of Pennsylvania, you have to get parent signature, school board approval, and the principal has to be willing to do it. But it has not been removed from the books. I mention this, though, because it should show you the mentality of some of the people in the state of Pennsylvania. Got an older senior population, that's kind of what happens. So discipline versus punishment. It's difficult when you talk about this in an education classroom. Discipline is a good thing. Discipline means to teach somebody what to do. Punishment means you're punishing them. You're giving them a negative response to inappropriate behavior. Public schools, you know, this attitude has changed because the public believes that keeping punishment private. And kids, their punishments in schools are private. I question that, because if a child's bullying consistently and you give them a 5-day suspension out of school and nobody knows that they got it for bullying, then they might think that kid just had a vacation. Does anything get solved? I don't know. So abuse and neglect, most common are physical, emotional, and verbal, sexual, physical, and then emotional or psychological. You know, some of you are going to see this, some of you aren't. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these. So what happens with physical abuse? Physical abuse are individuals that have frequent or unexplained injuries. I remember growing up as a kid in the 80s that there was a girl that went to our school who constantly fell down the stairs. She had broken arms, broken legs all the time, but she had a story, and every time anybody asked, she fell down the stairs. She had frequent injuries. People investigated. People did anything about it. You can't do anything if she said she's fallen down the stairs. If kids are complaining frequently of pain, that can be another thing. If they're wearing warm clothes in the summer to hide things, that can be a sign of abuse as well. They talk about harsh treatment at home. This is another big one. If they're early or stay late after school, that's big. You can tell a lot about that because they don't want to get home or they're anxious to get out of the home as well. You'll find a child that's physically abused is always happy on Monday, but on Friday, they're going to be a terror to deal with in your classroom. And that's because they're scared of going home. They're fearful of adults, especially their parents. Some can be malnourished. Some don't have logical explanations for injuries. Individuals that lack affection, giving and seeking, it probably could come from abuse. And some have been given inappropriate food, beverages, or drugs early on in their life, which kind of makes them prone to abuse. People that have been emotional and verbally abused, it's a little more difficult to tell as early childhood providers and as early childhood classroom teachers. But you can see them as shy and withdrawn or very aggressive. They're just unhappy people in general. They might have very childlike behaviors or very adult-like behaviors. You can see by their emotional intelligence the fact that they cry a lot in school. Some things scare them that shouldn't scare others. This could be, you know, somebody who has emotional abuse. So sexual abuse. This is tough to prove. You probably will not encounter this in a school setting, but you know it's something that you might see. And if you do, like I said, sexual abuse is one that I would not mess with. If I'm a teacher and I have a kid in the building that's complaining about sexual abuse, not only am I telling the guidance counselor, I'm telling the nurse, I'm telling the building principal, because you can't mess around with this one, because if it's not true, that can be worse. But you got to put the kid first. You're going to see kids like this that have torn or bloody clothes. They have pain or itching in the genital areas. They don't want to get along with other children. Another sign is rapid weight loss or gain. Some run away, they get involved in prostitution. Some use sexual terms and sexual activities at a very young age. You're going to see this more in middle school, obviously, but you'll see 6th graders who think that they're seniors in high school, and that could be because of sexual experiences they had. So physical neglect. It's not physical abuse, it's physical neglect. They're two different things. These are basically parents that don't pay money for things. These are parents that don't pay money or provide for certain weather conditions. Kids that don't want to play with other children. They don't shower, so they have a bad odor. Their clothes are never washed. They wear the same clothes all the time. They have medical or dental problems. They're hungry all the time because they're neglected, but they're not abused. There's a difference in that. You can fix neglect. You really can. because the school can provide food, the school can provide options for clothes, the school can provide mental or dental care, and we find that most parents are actually okay with this. Most parents would rather their kid be helped. If there's a neglect situation, if there's an abuse situation, they probably don't want their kids helped. So emotional and psychological neglect, you know, one of the things that we find in here, you're going to see these as kids that are really young that are going through a divorce that they quite don't understand. That causes a lot of emotional and psychological neglect. Also kids that have been moved from school to school or district to district. They're going to be absent or late all the time. They want the teacher to like them, so they do everything to gain the teacher's approval. They don't want to participate in extracurricular activities because they don't know if they're going to be around or they're going to see people all the time. Some will be using drugs and alcohol, stealing, sexual misconduct, or vandalism as well. So we said that physical abuse is the most common. You have to note that parents will give reasons that aren't reasonable based on the child's age or developmental stage. You need to look for changes in their behavior to see if there really were anything that did occur. If you can see changes in their emotional behavior, then there's a higher chance that physical abuse has occurred. So we have to talk, since this is a birth date class, shaken baby syndrome is seen in infants and young children. It's when you shake or toss a child in the air. Most of the time, this is just an innocent act of frustration. You get first-time parents who just get frustrated, but it leads to something worse. This could involve learning disabilities, seizures, and or death, and it's still common in the United States. So, I have found that emotional and verbal abuse doesn't really happen. You won't find the effect of it until most likely in middle school. Kids will experiment more with drugs and alcohol. Their social behaviors change. They have psychological disorders. So if they've been assaulted or treated poorly as a child, by the time they get to middle school, it's going to be worse. Because remember, in elementary school, as a teacher, you're creating opportunities where every kid should succeed all the time. And that sounds remedial and that sounds dumb, but we're basically doing stuff, and we want everybody to succeed all the time. Yes, we do. But in middle school, there's a division between what an A looks like, a B looks like, and a C looks like. If a kid works well in first and second grade, they should always get A's because we're giving them opportunities to be successful. So sexual abuse, sexual abuse happens, but it's not reported and discovered until many years later. This is normally, pornography, prostitution, rape, incest, fondling. You'll find that you might have a student who 5 years later comes out and says that they were sexually abused, but you would have had no clue as a teacher because it's not something they were openly speaking about at the time. So physical neglect, parents can be charged with this, and they can be charged with educational neglect if they fail to enroll their children in school or they allow their children to be truant from school. My experience has shown me that physical neglect is not as bad as the others, because if a child is being physically neglected and the state steps in or the school district steps in, most parents welcome that. They're not providing basic needs or care, maybe because they can't afford it. So the school can provide them with the opportunity. And think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This relates to safety and security. So emotional or psychological neglect, it's difficult to recognize. I already said this. Most states, including Pennsylvania, really don't include this in their reporting laws. This happens with parents that don't know how to show emotion or affection. We're going to talk a little bit about that if you take EDUC 104, which is child's environment. We really go over the parent that can't express their emotions well in that class. So one of the questions that everybody always asks me if this was a face-to-face class is, when is my kid ready to be home alone? There is no right answer for this. Some parents might say not until 12, some parents might say 8, some parents might say 10, some might say 6. Also depends if there are siblings around too. Our textbook gives us a couple of ideas of what should be. Does your kid say they want to stay home alone? Do they follow rules? Are they reliable and responsible? If an unexpected event occurs, would they handle it in a positive way? And can they entertain themselves for a long period of time without adult supervision? You get a kid that loves watching TV or loves playing a video game, they might not even know that you left for 2 or 3 hours. Kids should have to know safety and emergency procedures if something goes wrong. They have to be able to reach you if necessary, or another adult that might be in the neighborhood. The best way to do it is to try to leave them home alone for short periods, 5 and 10 minute periods at a time, about 20 or 30 of them, see how they do. If they do good, then you can do longer times. Fears are important though. If the child has fears, they're never going to be able to be left home alone, because then you're dealing with them psychologically. So, I give you, an issue to consider with cultural practice. One of the things that can happen too, different cultures in different areas do things that might not be child abuse. Vietnamese community saw that kid had bruises on their back and chest, but they saw that this is something to eliminate bad winds that would cause fever. It's a holistic practice, and it could cause bruising. So my question is that abuse? And some would say yes. I don't think so. It's a cultural thing. Cultural differences do affect how people parent. You shouldn't give up traditional cultural practices when you immigrate to this country, but if it's something that's serious, that could be a problem, I think it's important that you communicate with those types of parents. So teachers that have kids that are coming from those backgrounds should talk, and they can understand cultural differences as well. So, it's people look at this, and childhood abuse and neglect is researched a lot. The one challenge with research with this, and if I was, I teach doctoral level courses, but people say to me sometimes they want to study childhood maltreatment and neglect. You can't do it. The only way that you can do this, you have to interview the people who are the abusers, not the abusees. Because you can't interview a 7 or 8-year-old and use it in research and say, how were you abused? So that creates a problem as well. But the research that's there shows that there are 3 risk factors for children that are abused and neglected. And we're going to talk about each one of these a little bit. And I think these are important. So some of them are characteristics of adults that are that are likely to be abusers. And we'll talk about this a little as well. I'm sorry, I think one of my slides is out of order. Okay, here we go. So abusive and neglectful adults have anger and rejection, probably low self-esteem. You'll see ones that are isolated and lonely and don't have that many friends. Early marriage and early pregnancy is another sign of this as well. You come from a rural environment where some people are getting married at 19 and 20 years old. That can be different as well. Impulsive tendencies and low tolerance for stress, obviously drug and alcohol addiction, and poor problem-solving abilities can make a difference as well. So when a child is viewed as special, somebody who's abusive or neglectful can single them out because they might not be able to report what's going on. So if it's an individual who is physically unattractive, that might make them more prone to a certain type of abuse. If they're clumsy, ill, timid, or weak, if they're developmentally delayed, they're easier to abuse than people that aren't, and they're less likely to report it. So you have to be careful for this population of child. And here's the other one too. If for some reason they resemble someone the adult dislikes, that makes for an easy case to abuse as well. So what do you do? Early childhood programs and personnel do take steps to protect themselves. Most of you will have insurance as teachers. Even though you have insurance, I beg you, don't report anybody for abuse until you talk to other personnel in the district and send an email, put it in writing. I think blah, blah, blah might be suffering from physical abuse, because that keeps a paper trail and that keeps documentation. Teachers can conduct daily health checks when kids come into school. If kids are wearing t-shirts and shorts, you can easily look at a kid's arms and legs and see if anything's different. Hiring practices are important. It's why you all have to complete clearances, and why you're in a profession where it's kind of difficult because you have to complete clearances. So when you're hiring new employees, they have to have long-time background checks. Some of them, this could take 60 to 90 days. Try to contact their references, look at their past employment record, and make sure that they have formal training in early childhood and child development. It's difficult to have somebody in an early childhood class that hasn't been trained in it, and that kind of makes it difficult as well. So there should be a good, clear code of conduct about what a child and teacher behavior and their interaction should be. This can be a big part of in-service training. I find this is done more at the administrative level than it is at the teacher level, but you might see this in your buildings. If you see abusive behavior, you have to have a policy of non-tolerance and stick to it, and that'll get back.